I didn't press record in my thesis, which is cool, until maybe 5 or 6 minutes in. And then I was just like too burnt out on academic work to actually do anything about it for a while. And so um, this is just the last little bit. And, um, if we were presenting formally, this would be a whole thing, hi, Mara Kirdani-Ryan, now Dr. Mara Kirdani-Ryan. Um, and my thesis, what was my thesis and will continue to be my thesis and will somehow always be my thesis, identity fragmentation in post-secondary computing education. Um, I like to start this, and I started this by talking about storytelling, right? And so I argue, humans are fundamentally storytellers. We've told stories as collective histories built out of storytelling traditions. I'll note that Indigenous storytelling has been art, has been performance, and has been a way of transmitting knowledge, especially among the Duwamish, Squamish, Puyallup, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot tribes upon whose land I present this work. We've told stories to affirm who we've been and where. This is my hometown of Rochester, New York, where I never saw trans people, but trans people existed somehow. And now through this, I know that they existed because we have storytelling. We tell stories to find people like us and to share ourselves with others and to understand ourselves. A metamor is your partner's partner, for those unfamiliar with the polylingo, and it was coined on a Usenet forum in 2000. And we tell stories to know that we're not alone, that we're here, and that we've always been here. Humans are fundamentally storytellers, and the narratives which we center shape the lens through which we perceive the world. And I am most concerned with stories that we know by heart without ever voicing them out loud. And my favorite example of that is adulting, because I still don't feel like an adult despite being a doctor and having a job and having lots of things. Here we are, always learning about who we are. So there was a sociologist, Pamela Aronson, who was sort of seeing this conception of adulthood and wanted to dig into it and dig into what the dominant narrative was around adulting. And she talked to a bunch of people and she found that there was this track that you had to follow, right? And so once you completed your education, once you had a stable job, once you were financially independent from your family, once you got married, and once you had a kid, then you were adult, right? But you had to pass through all these tasks first, right? And no, this is obvious that you obviously don't have to do these to be an adult. You can have adult without being an adult, without getting married or having kids. But for a while, this was so true that it went without saying, right? It was this story that we knew by heart without ever having to tell it. Um, Through Pamela Aronson's work and others, we have alternatives. And so, I identify as queer. Jack Halberstam, in very, very, very short and brief form, says, instead of doing all the adulting crap, you could just be queer instead, and positions queerness as a mechanism through which one can reject established forms of legitimacy that, in cases of many queer folks, one might never fit fully, in favor of conceptions that more align with one's identity, right? And this isn't just around adulting, sort of this, like, we have a dominant narrative and we have a way to deconstruct it to make it something that fits us and our identity better. This is also true in education. Right? And so Paulo Freire is one of the centerpieces and foundations upon which I build my work. And Freire talks about education, sort of education is this mechanism for reproducing dominant narratives, right? And so by default, the way that we teach people to do anything is that we have these framings of how the world should work and what is important in the world, and we just try to fit those into students' heads, right? And this is banking education. It inhibits creativity and domesticates consciousness by isolating it from the world, denying people of their vocation to become more fully human. And as an alternative, he talks about this problem posing education instead, right? So rather than as an instructor and educator, I have dominant narratives and just put them into the heads of students, he says, well, we could have education be this constant unveiling of reality whereby students become critical co-investigators in dialogue, which I think is cool. And so this is sort of how I came to my thesis and how I came to this work and how I come to my life broadly, is that I want spaces where everyone can learn who they are instead of how they should be. But if I did this, the scope is so broad that I'd never actually finished my PhD. And so I'm situating within computing. I want computing spaces, computing classrooms, to be spaces where students and I, right, can learn who we are instead of how we should be. And I'm situating for here for two reasons. because I forgot to do that. I'm here for two reasons, right? First, computing is shaping and reshaping the society as we know it, frequently in ways that are magnifying dominant norms of oppression and structural oppression. We know that computing has reified narratives around racism and sexism and ableism and colonialism and transphobia and intersections between these in ways that inflict systemic violence upon those who have no understanding of how the technology works, right? But more than that, this is personal to me. This is one of the first spaces where I made friends easily, where collaborations came naturally, where I didn't have to bend my back to be understood. And when I came to computing, I presented as a white, upper middle class, heterosexual, able-bodied, nerdy boy who was excited about video games. I fit the identity-based expectations in computing spaces, but the cultural expectations as well. And I liked it here. And I stuck around for a while. And I started learning what it meant to be a computer scientist, right? And not just what it means to code, but what it means to be part of this group that knows how to code. And it turns out this is pretty common. Any active learning is tied up with some notion of participation, and that means, what it means to be not only one who codes, but one who is part of a community of people who knows how to code, one of who's a coder, right? One of those technologists, computer scientist people. And the most powerful piece here is legitimacy, right? And so for me, that meant that, taking the most difficult, grueling classes that you could, working 90-hour weeks and having your only friends be lab friends because that's the only space where you saw each other, or really saw anyone. It meant TAing and moving towards teaching, not because you liked teaching, because it signaled that you weren't just good at computer architecture, you were a computer architecture top gun. My dead name is the last in the list. It meant that success was taking your degree and getting the fanciest, most selective job that you could, not because you wanted that, but because it made the world made sense just a little bit more, right? And I was miserable here, and I was miserable doing all this, and I didn't have a great sense of who I was then, and I got lots of validation following dominant narratives of legitimacy, and it was fine for a while. And I don't see this as wasted time, just not really my time, right? I was learning about things that I enjoyed. I was learning more about myself. But the space of options that felt available to me was just so limited that I didn't even consider jobs that involved teaching until someone suggested them to me. And I didn't consider computing education research until someone came to UW and offered the idea that this was even a possibility. And there wasn't really literature out there that described my experience. So we know that computing is sexist, we know it's racist, we know it's ableist, we know it's transphobic, but we don't really know how it causes harms to folks that fit here, right? And might be the very valid pushback, hey, isn't this the white academic thing where you center your own narratives over others' racialized experiences? And I'm like, yeah, it is. But these aren't separate things, right? They don't need to be separate things. The goal is the same of collective justice and a culture of love. And I am just uniquely positioned to offer, for me, I guess, offer healing and offer knowledge to those with whom I share experience. That's how I'm situating this work. So I've been sitting with this question, who do students become by virtue of their participation in computing education? In part to answer, how did this place that nourished me separate me so far from who I am? And I spent 5 years sitting on this question, and I have a giant thesis statement that's long, right? But I will give you the short version, in that community is a profound, fundamental human need that we will nearly always bend to get. But when we realize that there are people who will welcome us as we are, we can start to work towards change. Then we got a reading room. You get it. Cool. Okay, this is a celebratory fence. Woo! Yeah. This mostly isn't a happy talk. If for those of you that know me, this maybe isn't surprising. But it does hurt quite a bit to be here. And so the warning that I'll be talking about various forms of pain that students experience here, including racialization, including ableism, including some neurodivergent trauma, as well as yeah, I do talk about that. Statistics around suicidality. And my ask is that you try to view these experiences from a space of compassionate witnessing, right? But I recognize that we all harbor our own hurts here. And so let's see, growth only happens when you consent into a space. And so if you're not here with your consent, there's no bad time to leave, and that includes now. Cool. Great. I'm still hopeful here, right? I refuse to have my work solely explicate how the world causes harm without offering hope and possibility for the future. We will get there. We have to go through the ache first, right? We cannot give authentic hope to a world without witnessing the ways that it causes pain. Cool? Cool, okay. No, that's great. So I center storytellings and narratives, and through the American tradition of storytelling, where what you do for work comes before any pertinent detail of your life except for your name, we are going to start there. With how students learn to choose employment. Let's see, I'll go back. I'll talk about how students learn to approach computing work, and then I'll talk about these two together. This is sort of the last chapter of my dissertation and the bulk of where we spend our time. Cool. Okay. So here. We know lots about why students pursue computing. Yeah. We know that how folks view computing as a career, right? What they think computer scientists do, who they think belongs in computer science, influences their decision to pursue computing. We know that self-efficacy beliefs also influence. So this is the little engine that could. And so self-efficacy is your belief in your ability to do something. So like the I think I can actually makes you more able to do the thing that you want to do. They were right. They were right this whole time. We know that structural barriers affect folks' choice to pursue computing as well. That can include racialization, and it can also include intro instructors that spell bullshit like women don't code because of biological factors, and I've that are still gainfully employed by the university. Yeah. We know lots about why students choose computing degrees. We don't know much about what they do with it, right? Especially as they become computer scientists, we have kind of this gap here of like, we know what gets them to a computing classroom and a computing degree. We have these little pieces of knowledge about what it means to be a technologist in the workforce and how students learn to navigate that, but we don't actually know how they navigate this mess of career fairs and technology career fairs. And this is self-serving, right? I'm like, why did I end up here at this big fancy tech company when I could have ended up somewhere that would have made me ever so slightly more happy? And so I was sort of coming to this with these questions, right? So because my autistic ass is obsessed with what the norms are in social spaces. I'm like, well, what norms exist here, right? How do folks end up choosing the careers that they choose? How are these norms reinforced by folks in the spaces that they're in, and how are they experienced by students, right? And this is just a lot of talking. I talk to people and I listen to them, and that's qualitative research and it's great. And I do lots of analysis on that too. And then I can surface out what it means to exist here and what it means to exist legitimately here. Right? And what I found, so first, students learn to prioritize departmental legitimacy, tier ranking various jobs based on their proximity to what the department considered to be prestige. And so in that case, this was big 4 technology firms. This is the 4 biggest recruiters at this institution, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, and Google at the time of the study. So one student said, if you get into the big 4, I think you've made it. I think it's a form of getting validation for me. I think a lot of people say, they specifically have the resources available for me to do this project, but maybe like subconsciously everyone thinks I must be a successful person. And if I get this job, that's the next step in being a successful person. So that's what I must aim for. I think that's maybe under a lot of people's heads, because that's definitely under mine. There were other quotes in this, the chapter in the paper around this, perceptions of these employers, how other firms and prospects compared, and the degree to which students positioned prestige as they were thinking about their various options over things like fulfillment, over things like, let's see, the impact of their careers. And I found that this wasn't accidental, right? This was like a byproduct of existing in this department, right? So this school, organizations with established capital use that capital to win at recruiting, right? Using their established footholds to gain bigger and bigger footholds in the department space. When students went to get advice on their careers, even if it was something like a resume review, advice givers would assume that they were going for what was legitimized within the department until students explicitly said, I don't want that, right? Most folks didn't. And then when students went through courses and curricula, that coursework was motivated by, well, you want this big fancy job, right? And so you should learn, let's say, data structures, not because it's a good foundational piece of computer science, theory, because it'll let you pass a coding interview so you can get an internship at Google. And this largely aligns with prevailing stereotypes around technologists and computer science broadly. It is the Tech Bro Starter Pack, but this doesn't really give space for students to consider how they position themselves within this space, right? And so that was what my work was surfacing as well. And for students, they didn't always most of them didn't want this, right? They felt like a sellout, right? So one student was talking about what it was like, they felt that other students on the campus perceived CS majors to be, cutthroat and super competitive, and that
you're just a sellout, you're just doing that to make a lot of money. But when it came time to make a career decision, they just felt that way. They didn't feel or perceive that another option was available to them. They wanted to create equality in the world. They didn't feel like they could. Other students sort of found alternatives. So one called out the article about why women don't code and said, wow, this is really frustrating, but was intent on pursuing jobs in educational technology. And so they found a mentor that just kept asking them questions and kept helping them sort out what it meant to do something that was at odds with who they were. And in the end, they found work that was more aligned with them. They found, work towards tech with social impact, but it was tiring, it was exhausting. It required them to go cross country to learn about these interests that they have, right? So culturally, we're emphasizing prestige, right? We're emphasizing career prestige in this really, really narrow pocket of career prestige, right? That one doesn't fit, expectations of students coming into this department, but two, discourages folks that feel like there isn't another option besides selling out and becoming this. Yeah. Cool. How we doing? Yeah. So you have this, right? And so then, I sat with this and I was like, okay, well, like, I know why I ended up with the big fancy job that I have. And I understood why I disconnected my work from my values and more about myself. But if the values weren't aligned, right, the values of the institution that I was a part of weren't aligned with myself, like, well, why did I fit here? I never really had friends generally. Like, why did I fit here? And I'm framing this as, how students learn to approach computing work, but really this is, for me, was about neurodivergence and neurodivergent legitimacy. And I was coming to terms with my own, and I was seeing a lot of, I was seeing affinity with the parts of myself that I describe as autistic, and other folks that I've felt and experienced expressions of in computing spaces, right? This is not naming names or calling anyone anything. Everyone gets to choose their words for themselves. But I just felt like I fit here, and the parts of myself that don't fit many other places fit better here. And so, again, right, we know lots about racialization and sexism and ableism in computing. We don't know much about neurodivergence in computing, but we know a lot about how neurodivergent folks are legitimized broadly, right? And so this is the less fun slide, okay? So we know that electroshock therapy continues to be used on and against neurodivergent individuals. We know that about a third of autistic individuals consider suicide, about 1 in 4 attempt. And the insurance system, for all that it doesn't cover, covers ABA, a therapeutic practice designed to impose neuronormative expectations on autistic children, and that causes PTSD in about half of the folks it purports to treat. We know about all that, but we don't really know about computing. Right? We know that how it exists in society broadly, but we don't know about this narrow slice that we exist in. And so I was like wondering, how do students learn to approach computing work in this way, right? And so through this lens, I was wondering, I'm not going to get too into the weeds about neurotype expressions, right? This is I can't name anyone's identity. I can just see how they present themselves to me, right? And that's a kind of narrow slice of that lens. And this is a wildly problematic topic. I use this example in my proposal. So Sir Simon Baron-Cohen is the founder of the autistic diagnostic criterion that was continues to be used today in most spaces. There are slightly better ones that have come around. He wrote a book, which is great, that talks about men and women, right, have always seemed to think in entirely different ways. But are these differences created by society, or do our minds come ready wired one way or another, with female brains tending towards interaction and male brains toward organization? And then he continues, and could this mean that autism, rather than being simply a mental anomaly, is in fact simply an extreme male brain? In 2012, which is great. And we know that diagnoses are problematic. So I tried something else. I was like, I don't want to use this crap. I don't want to cite this crap. I don't want to use this crap. I don't want any part of that. So I said, okay, let's say that people are distributed on a bell curve, right? In part because that's how random variables distributed in nature work. In part because, as a society, we tend to smush people, right, that are towards the middle, right? That's normativity. That's how that works. And yeah, I said, like, well, let's do this around attention, right? Since there's so much based around that. And I could say, okay, some people are really, really, really good at focusing in on a single task, and they maybe struggle to switch away from that task, right? So this might look like it's really easy for me to start talking and dissertating endlessly, but it's maybe tricky for me to remember that I need to like stop and drink water or rest my voice or do something like that. And some brains maybe struggle to maintain focus on a single task, but do really, really well when they're sort of like bouncing around to 6 or 7 different ones, right? And it's not that like this is good or this is good or this is good, right? They're just, different ways of brains being different, right? And so I presented this to participants and I said, okay, on this graph, right, label yourself, label how you perceive folks in computing spaces and how you perceive folks that are not only survive, but thrive here, folks that are legitimized here, right? And I got back something like this. The best part of this is that it's funny. So this participant, how they saw themselves, how they saw folks in computing, how they saw folks legitimized in computing, right? Best part of this is that it's not even data, right? Like these kind of just got scrapped after the interview, right? It's more about how this can be used to catalyze a conversation about a topic that no one really knows how to disconnect from the gross genderist expectations around identity. No? Neurodivergence. So I had one of these, actually I had 9 of these, and I sort of offered them to students and faculty within this institution, and then also industry professionals around Puget Sound. There were lots of interviews and lots of things. I wasn't too persnickety about like the narrow bounds of this institution or the narrow bounds of Puget Sound. Some folks had left recently, that was fine. But I found, let's see, 3 big things. So first, computing spaces legitimize a particular and narrow pocket of neurodivergence that lies outside neuronormative expectations, right? So it's not that computing spaces mirror societal norms broadly, like they do in careers, right? The world kind of encourages you to go towards prestige and continue going towards prestige. This was different, right? And that folks that didn't fit this narrow pocket, whether they were identified as neurodivergent or not, masked their neurotype expressions to fit expectations within computing. Normally, we see masking as a thing that autistic individuals do to exist and persist in society broadly. Turns out everyone does it in computing that doesn't fit here, right? Everyone. But for those that were legitimized, for those that fit this narrow pocket, computing spaces could be a refuge against broader societal delegitimization, right? There was a space to exist and thrive here that didn't exist anywhere else. And so I can talk through attention, right? One of these bits. And it was put really, really clearly, right, by some participants, like coders are some hyperfixating pieces of shit. But then, more eloquently, I'd say, right, but what's important to an enterprise is this work, right? There's no amount of people you can throw at a problem, no amount of process that you can create that's a substitute for a person or a small group of people working really, really deeply on a problem. And I could talk about masking too. So a ADHD identifying faculty member, right? In college, I thought there were enough people who were different, and then through grad school, but grad school in the pandemic, several of my ADHD friends dropped out. A lot of them weren't diagnosed yet. They got diagnosed after that dropped out, or they got fired by their advisors or whatever. I think what bothers me, I think a lot of people with the way my brain works are attracted to research and can be really good researchers. And so you end up with overrepresentation at the beginning, followed by dropping off, until it's like, I guess, underrepresented at this point, especially at the faculty level. And that really bothers me because it's just so unnecessary. But then folks also talked about refuge. They talked about what it meant historically for the space to exist for folks that leaned more towards hyperfocus. Yes, single task A was a euphemism for that. But also how, personally, they felt like leaving computing, but this felt like the only thing they could do because it was flexible, right? Because they could have days where they didn't want to do stuff today, and any other job, they couldn't really say that, right? And so they wondered, could I actually do anything else with the way my attention span works? So, this isn't great. It's not great. But it turns out we can be even more specific about why it's not great. And then we can use that to do something that's absolutely gorgeous. Cool. We're like transitioning into study 3. How we doing? Cool. Yay. Okay. This is also like, I was sitting sort of figuring out like, what do I want to do to finish off my dissertation? How do I want to exist in this space? And exclusive critique is a well-worn path towards cynicism. And education is a fairly interventionist discipline. So it's like, oh, let's actually do something. And so, do the thing. So, I've got all this work surfacing norms, right? I've got 2 papers. There's been lots of other folks that have done this too. but like no one knows what we do with it, right? We're still trying to figure out what we do with it. And so, I can say, okay, pedagogically, computing spaces encourage neurotypical folks to mask their expressions, to be more towards hyperfocus, but like, what do we do with that, right? And so I started pulling from literature in social work and education broadly to explore, and I tried this one version of it, right? This is sort of the vogue computing education tack, right, of ethics education, right? Like, computing's doing bad things in the world, right? Like really, really bad things. And like maybe if we taught technologists ethics, right, they would be better, right? Which isn't a bad tack. And I tried it and I learned some things, but it wasn't necessarily situated with students. And what I mean by that is that one, students aren't actively consenting into that deconstruction, right? We know lots from social work that really you can only grow if you're consenting into a space. And then what's being discussed isn't always relevant to students' context. And so if I position this through, dominant narratives that are held by students, right? Like it's great. Maybe there's coincidental overlap that I talk through, what Amazon is doing that's bad, and that, sort of figures into how students conceptualize their identity, but it's coincidental, right? It doesn't necessarily work in a way that encourages students to grow. And so I was curious about what might happen in a dedicated space, and so I made one. And this was the piece that was exciting for me was that this was co-constructed, right? So I had a space, I had a course title, and I had a course description. And I had maybe 2 classes planned, and everything after that, it was just a space for students to talk through what they wanted to talk through and process what they wanted to process and work towards what they wanted to work towards, right? And we could sort of collectively decide the direction of that course together. I'll note that when we get systemic ramifications was supposed to be political ramifications, but the word political was too political for this department, as seemingly am I. But I had this idea of identity work that I described in my proposal. So there was a request for SAS. I had like a little RSVP that went out that was like, what would be helpful in this space? So SAS was helpful. I had this conception of identity work, right? So it's like, what does it mean to grow as a person, to learn more about yourself as a person? So, and I said, okay, we have our identity, who we are, as the set of stories that we use to describe ourselves, and let's worry less about the spaces that we hold membership. But as we move through, we have these stories that we tell about ourselves, and we can sort of pull them apart, right? Not all of them are ours and authentically ours. Some of them are sort of like within the dominant narratives of racism and sexism and ableism and transphobia, and we can sort of pull those apart. And when we do, and we make them visible and we question them, we can have a space for movement that we didn't have one before, right? And I call that space agency. And it's okay, well, when you actually move into that space and find an expression that's authentic to you with a space that's been created by deconstructing dominant narrative, that's the identity work piece, right? And I was doing this and I was moving through it, and I had these questions. I was like, oh, how can we foster that? How can we connect students' personal narratives and dominant narratives, and what changes happen when we actually move through this process? And I had a bunch of sources of data. I was like reflecting after every class, and I was taking notes, and I was asking students to reflect on the topics that we had. I was interviewing students. Prior work is focused on demographically divergent focus groups, right? Do like pick a set of students, interview at the start, interview at the end. I focused on folks who had emotional resonance with the material. This was students who started crying after class, students who asked for space, students who stepped into a particularly vulnerable discussion as part of the class time. That felt fine. And then I did member checking. So I did all of this, and I developed themes, and I went back to students and said, okay, like, do these actually match your experience in being in this course? Does the knowledge that I've created actually match what you're telling me? But I found with all of this that theoretically, the framing of identity work that I had was a little bit insufficient, right? And so let's see. And this is like into the course, like maybe 2 or 3 weeks into the course, I realized that like the way that I'm talking about this doesn't really match students' experience. And I don't know, I've been in and out of therapy for like 12 years at this point. So I was like, okay, like what about parts work, right? And if you're unfamiliar, so Richard Schwartz is the white Western canonical figure in this. He is not the only white Western canonical figure. There were others. This is also a really, really, really old technique and sort of framing of how people think about themselves. Way, way, way older than Richard Schwartz. But this is academia, so we stick with us. We all contain multiple parts, some cohesive, some in conflict, right? And the goal with this is that folks have a sense of leadership, right? They can hear sort of disparate voices of themselves, some, encouraging certain actions, some discouraging certain actions. They can hear the set of voices and still make forward decisions and make forward progress in their lives. And this is the different framing of identity work that I came to. So bringing about the self-leadership practice, making sure that all voices are heard and decisions are made with all voices in mind. The fun bit is that he thanks his ex-wife in the acknowledgements for this book, but that's like a fun aside tangent. Which is, for all the psychologists that were terrible, right? Like, proof that we're getting better as a world is that, one of them is like, thank you, my ex-wife, for letting me do this thing and sacrificing our relationship for doing it. And I call that progress, y'all. I think that's great. So we have this, we can't always hear every part of ourselves that has something to say. And so the other part of parts work is that when folks smush themselves into normative expectations or experience trauma, there's this split that happens, or the split that can happen, right? Where folks say, okay, the part of me that holds this experience that's traumatic, or the part of me that doesn't fit this societal expectation is over here now, right? And there's two parts of that split. One is the part that's being sort of smushed away, and the other is the part that's sort of maintaining that fragmentation. And that's not a permanent state of being, obviously. But reconciling that requires witnessing, both making sense, recognizing that there is fragmentation, and making sense of why that fragmentation occurred in the first place. And you can do a lot with this. You can talk about code switching, you can talk about masculinizing, you can talk about passing, you can talk about all the ways that folks consciously and unconsciously sort of present themselves and hide themselves. But turns out this fits really well. So primarily, cultural norms encourage identity fragmentation for persistence in post-secondary computing education. Perhaps this isn't news, but I conceptualized it this way. I said, okay, folks have a disciplinary identity, right? There's been prior work in computing education that talks about how folks conceptualize themselves as a computer scientist and as an engineer. We've got that, and we've got, folks' positional identity. And I'm broadly construing this to be aspects of identity associated with positionality, but I'm more concerned with how these are different than each other than any specifics of either of them, right? This is not a giant education talk about identity and what we mean by identity. And so with this, some folks might not fragment at all, right? It might be that you can bring your entire positional identity into your disciplinary space. It might mean that what I would hypothesize is more common, that folks have not developed a positional identity that is meaningfully different and distinct from their disciplinary identity. So as you've made your life your work, this is the CS starter pack meme, but I didn't study that. But for others, it might be that this fragmentation is in your best interest. And that's what I found. Students talked about, students, regardless of their positional identity, talked about how it felt like they were two different people, right? Or that when they reflected on their identity, how they relate who they were to what they do, that the two were completely separate in their mind. And I was sort of wondering, why do this, right? And it was in their best interest to separate themselves, right? Despite parts work and oodles of theoretical frameworks talking about how that isn't what anyone should ever have to do. So one student talked about how they wanted to be able to bring more of their positional identity to their work, right? They wanted to be able to do work that excited them, that they found enjoyment from, and they tried to bring that to the classes they were participating in. But because of the group dynamic and because of the space, that just all went away, and they were just doing the bare minimum. And so it's like, okay, like there isn't space to bring your positional identity to coursework, right? What do you do? And maybe you make friends, but most people found that there wasn't a way to make friends in CS courses. There wasn't a way to connect with people through their positional identity, right? It was just all so based around the disciplinary identity. And, you can't find friends. What do you do? Maybe you try to like talk to peers, but folks found that every time they tried to talk to peers, every time they tried to bring an aspect of their positional identity into a discussion, they get judged, right? Even just like bringing up a queer topic in class to test the waters didn't go well. And so folks tried to survive as best they could. And so that meant when folks experienced outright racism in computing spaces, they had this reaction of, oh my God, did you guys see that? Did nobody see that? No one's going to talk about that, and just kind of hit it and parceled it away. One student that identified as a transgender woman found that she couldn't keep a voice that was authentic to her when talking about programming. A third student, goodness, I'm just gonna read this. I see computing spaces devoted to social good. I see some computing spaces devoted to social good. I've been interested in spaces before, but they often seem isolated, saviorist, and disconnected from the real problem, which is the structure of the tech industry. So, we see this like critical reflection on what the world is and how it is. I feel like no one, and maybe just me, knows what to do on a systemic level, and participating in this institution while understanding that it is oppressive can be depressing. So I see people around me either ignoring the harm or joining the cult of tech bros who believe that capitalism is bringing about revolutionary progress, and sometimes I could wish I could do the same, right? This is the no way out, right? This is like, I see that this isn't working for me, and I don't see another option, and so I'm just going to try to persist as best I can. So to recap, right? Folks couldn't bring themselves to coursework. They couldn't make friends within courses. They couldn't make friends at all because every time they tried to connect authentically, they were judged. And they couldn't even share how it felt to be here with anyone who might understand. So they felt silence, lost their voice, and they lost their desire to help make the world whole. And I didn't do terribly much to hear about all of this, right? I just created a container that was geared towards students who didn't necessarily fit here, geared towards deconstructing dominant norms, and asked them to talk about how it felt to be here. They were hungry for the space, they were hungry for this discussion, and as soon as they found it, I had someone crying after most of my classes for the first several weeks. And some people here are from other institutions, and so maybe this is like, oh, maybe this isn't, maybe this is just a UW thing. And I'm like, yeah, that's fair. But I did the job search circuit thing recently, and I asked everywhere I went, to what degree do marginalized students feel safe in your computing classrooms, and how do you know? And I asked that because I kind of know for a fact that no one actually collects data that's that would give an answer to that, give a robust answer to that, in a way that's backed by student voices. And not everyone that I've given experiences of here was systemically marginalized. Not all of them had positional identities that are marginalized in computing broadly. Some of them just didn't fit here, fragmented themselves regardless. But like parts work, we're not stuck here, right? So it's not just that students fragment and there's nothing that we can do about it. I found that I could make a space, right? And a space could be made, students and I, where there was space to resolve that. And so with this, I prioritized co-construction, I prioritized student agency, I made the class opt-in, right? So everything was consensual, everything from class time to homeworks to discussions, students could leave at any time without penalty. I wouldn't have it affect their grade. It's also a seminar, pass, no pass, but grades are fake anyways. And I found that for students to reconcile this fragmentation, they needed, from parts work, right, recognition that the fragmentation had occurred, right, and an understanding of why it had occurred. With that, right, a safe and vulnerable environment that welcomed their positional identity, right, giving space to invite sort of this part of themselves that fragmented off back into their disciplinary space. And then the last piece I'm probably most intrigued by, right, centering students' experiences of shared fragmentation over any aspect of their positional identity, right? So it was not a women in tech space, it was not a neurodivergent in tech space, it was not a minorities in tech, Black in tech space. It was a space for folks that didn't fit here, and that was enough to create a community. And I'm glossing over some details, and my thesis is lovely. It is long, but it is lovely. And I want to get what happened next. Not everyone reconciled their identity, but those that did started to find themselves again. And so for the student that felt, jaded and felt like they didn't have another option other than just persist here, at the end, they were saying, I guess I've been trying to figure out what actually to do with everything for so long. I'm finally getting out of my jadedness and into like, I think I can visualize for me what I want to do going forward, right? So this experience of this is the fun part, right? Like reconciling folks' positional identities with their disciplinary identities actually means that they can have wants here again, right? That they're not siloing those off. But it also meant that it was more visible when they didn't fit here, right? So they could see more solutions, but also the problems became more present, and it's harder to paper over them. And the most exciting piece for me, I think, was that students were able to consider activism. And so this was sort of a multi-step process as we moved through, like, what does it mean to be here? How do we not fit here? What are all the ways we don't fit here? And then we started to talk about sort of what do you want, right? What do you want? And they had a lot of wants, which was great. And so with this, right, I had nearly 50 ideas from a group of students that didn't know each other at the start of this course, all of which, and not only did they make this, they were starting to strategize about, how to prioritize these, how to bring them to departmental leadership, right? They were actively like looking to figure out how to engage with their departmental space in a way that was authentic, that in a way that was making change that was in their best interest, right? And it was a phenomenal amount of emotional work for me and a phenomenal amount of emotional work for them. But it's possible to go from being jaded about your life and prospects in computing to activism in 10 weeks, 1/4. And critically, what we haven't known in computing education broadly is that this fragmentation, this identity fragmentation, might be what prevents students from engaging in activism. Yeah. And so there's more work to do here. This is sort of what I recognized at the end of this course. I was like, it's cool. It's just not everything I'd want. I'm also, yeah. And I would love help here. And what I've got so far, right? So identity fragmentation occurs through dominant disciplinary norms in computing education. These are both norms that mirror societal norms, as with prestige, and norms that contradict societal norms, as with neurodivergence. Some folks described relatively little friction, or even affirmation by cultural norms in computing, but those that experienced it had few official routes for resolution within their disciplinary space. This usually meant either going somewhere else or leaving or just trying to persist. And then I argue with this. Parts work is a framing that's designed around trauma, right? And this is the capital T trauma, the trauma that lands you in the ED or shows up in a doctor's visit. Yeah. Yeah. And we have been expanding what it means to experience trauma extensively for the past 40 years. And so for me, I would argue that this fits here. And so it seems like computing culture is traumatic, and it seems like we have evidence of that. We knew this, right? Folks have talked about what it means to be Black in computing spaces and what's meant to be femme in computing spaces for a while. But that it's traumatic for everyone, right? Not just folks with marginalized positional identities, but for everyone. That's one. Second, it's not universal fragmentation, and some folks with strong identities found ways to resolve it independently, but it can be scaffolded, right? And so this experience, right? This is from the careers, what are we, 80 slides back, right? That like it is possible to have a mentor or sort of facilitator that sort of brings reconciliation to students as fragmentation, right? And then third, engaging students in activism is messy, nonlinear, individual, and may require resolution. This is a framework that I'm not going to talk about deeply, but how we've conceptualized bringing students to activism in the past is sort of this trajectory, the circular trajectory, right? Where we deconstruct cultural norms, we realize that we have agency here, we actually look to create change, and then we change it, and then we reflect and we come back, right? And this is what I used when I was integrating counter narratives into ethics education, into computer systems. But what I found is that there's an alternative frame for parts work, right? Where if you are fragmented, if what you want here isn't part of who you are here, it's going to be awfully hard to figure out what you want to change. And then my piece for this is that this is probably especially true for those that have developed an identity in computing. And so given that this happened to students, I wonder what happened to those of us that have been here for a while, right? And I've been through a lot of therapy to figure out what happened to me. And so it might be worth figuring out what happened to you. Maybe don't do it alone. Yeah. And so, yeah, community is a profound, fundamental human need. Bessel van der Kolk puts it as, all of us need confidence that others will know, affirm, and cherish us. Without that, we can't develop a sense of agency that will enable us to assert, this is what I believe in, this is what I stand for, this is what I will devote myself to. And this was an act of love that, like, I did love being here for a while, and I'm not really going to be here anymore. And so to end with an ask, that there's nothing more that I want than to be in a space where within their own agency, consent, and capacity, people choose to turn towards love and build their work around it. And it is beyond me or beyond any single individual. But my ask is that with all of this, the work that you choose to do continuously challenges your conceptions of what is possible, so that we might catch glimpses of how the world might be. And so with that, Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and thank you for offering space to witness what I have to offer here. I'll take your questions now. And if you want to read the big hacking thing, it's there, but it's like,
Thank you so much, Mara. So we've got about 10 minutes for questions, and I'll ask the committee members to just move forward until we run out of audience questions. Audience questions?
there is a hand raised. Yeah.
Here's that. Easy setup for.
It's not. We're gonna really, really try it. Let's see.
Can you hear me?
Hey. Go for it.
Thank you so much, Mara. I sort of knew what you were going to talk about, but I'm blown away, and this is very powerful. This is very useful, and I think it's going to be very impactful. I would like to acknowledge that in the course of your work, you've had an outsized impact on me, and you've helped me on my journey to realize a lot of the things that you're talking about and how they've affected me. And you've already helped me move towards love, exactly in the way that you say, around inclusivity and agency. And I sort of got these things parallel from the trajectory that I started on from talking to you. And it's really something incredible to see all of these, this grounding and these frameworks that you've put together and assembled. I would really like to be able to talk to you because I've been interested in your work in the last 2 years, and we haven't yet had a chance to talk. I really hope that that will come. The thing that I find, if I just had one question to ask of you, I think the thing I find most compelling is two things. This idea that you talk about identity fragmentation and how, because we're all solving our own little problem in our own little corner, we're all alone, we can't do anything about it. And I would like to throw the idea that even what you perceive as a dominant group is struggling with this.
Yeah.
And the second idea that really sticks out for me is what you call prestige. I don't call it prestige. I would like to talk more about that notion, but what I connect it to is narcissism. When you don't know what it is that you're striving for, and so you have no objective function to go forward in life.
Yeah.
And so what you call dominant narrative, what I think of is as narcissism production machines. And the reason I'm saying that is because thinking of narcissism as the core problem that we're trying to solve helps me understand it beyond discipline boundaries, which I find very helpful because I think that disciplines also fragment us in approaching this problem.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
my question to you, and I'm sorry for this long rambling, is is this a connection that you've made? Is this something that you thought about?
Yeah. Thank you first. Narcissism. I mean, this is the I think everyone should make their own words for this if they want to be persnickety about words. And if they want my words, that's great. For me, it's more the problem of how we've lived so much of our lives smushing and bending in ways that don't actually serve us. And so with that, we've never actually been given a chance to conceptualize who we are and ground in who we are. And without that, yeah, it's really, really easy to get pushed around and pushed towards things that aren't necessarily what you want, but are a good capitalistic endeavor. I mean, how I conceptualize neurodivergent legitimacy is like, it's fine if you're autistic as long as that's serving the machine. And as soon as you have needs beyond that, then you're a problem. And so yeah, we should connect and talk more because this is lovely. And I want to make space for other folks' questions. But yeah, this is I've been conceptualizing this for myself as like, this is situated in computing But this is really just trying to figure out the piece of how computing smushes people, but there's lots of other ways that the world smushes people. This is just the one that I'm positioned to find out. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
If anybody needs to leave for passing to other meetings, feel free to leave.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love your talk. It's great. It's amazing. I think one thing I was interested in understanding more about is like how you scaffold in your class, how you scaffold that idea of like students not thinking in fragments about their own identity and like moving towards love and like
Yeah.
I just imagine that it's probably such a difficult thing with so many different people from different identities with backgrounds.
Yeah,
How you
right.
get them to that point where like or even like how you would have another instructor be because I feel like you got
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's fair.
I guess can't do all your stuff, but probably you want other people to learn how to do it too.
Right.
But yeah, like what?
Yeah. Yeah. This is like how to get folks with different experiences to sort of see the same goal and the same reality. Yeah. So for me, that was kind of something continuous moving through it, right? And something I was trying to be conscious of. And that like with folks coming in, I was like, okay, I know we need more spaces for Black students in computing to talk about what it means to be Black here, right? And for trans students in computing to talk about what it means to be trans here, right? Like I know we need all of that, but I cannot facilitate that under the umbrella that we have here. And so for me, there's a paper from 2017 that talks about shifting the spotlight, right? That was like, students, primarily, this is CompuGirls, right? So primarily focused on Black women, but folks bringing in their queer identity to sort of talk about how aspects of that influence their experience. And for me, this is sort of shifting, like making sure I tied to the undercurrent of commonality without invalidating anyone's experience, right? So like there's a class on masking, right? Where I was like, okay, we can talk about masking from a neurodivergent lens. We can also talk about code switching. It's not theoretically different. It's different pain, but the same poison, right? We can talk about how folks masculinize themselves in computing spaces, right? Like we can talk about how queer and trans folks have to pass here in really weird and confusing ways. Like again, it's not same poison, just different ways of surfacing that experience, right? And so for me, this is more of a like, let's just try to keep tying back to that it's not, let's see, it does hurt more for some folks to be here, right? But it's more about what we want to accomplish with the pain that we have than just focusing on all the hurt that we have. I have ideas about how I would teach someone else to do this. The first step I would probably invite them is to consider therapy and a lot of it, because that's just kind of part of doing teaching work broadly. And then so this was kind of a product created in my own self-image, right? And that like I enjoy vulnerable conversations. And so I sort of steered the space with the agency that I had towards facilitating that, right? And I would fully understand if, other folks have different skills and different wants and different desires and different ways that like make their teaching resonate with them. And I would encourage them to move towards those rather than this conception that I had, right? So like I don't like my goal isn't that I don't want it to be like you take this framework and use it, much more like this is a way that I made art. You could make art this way too. And if you want to sort of talk about how to work through that medium, we should have a discussion because it's different. It's really different. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts, and feelings? Oh, thank you. Oh, yeah. Peregrine, go for it.
Hi, amazing talk and super important work. I have a question. When it comes to neurodiversity, it often there's so many attributes that we talk about of what makes or how to tell if you're neurodiverse. But I find it really hard to come up with a list of attributes that are like these are the neurotypical attributes. And as someone who's had to compare and contrast these two things, these two different worlds, what is your list?
Can this like not be part of the work I'm defending? This can I just like give the off the cuff comment?
You don't have to, you can give answers, you don't have to defend all answers.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, this is just curiosity.
So the way that I am neurodivergent is not the way that everyone is neurodivergent. And I would argue that, you know, like the like everyone's a little gay joke, right? Which isn't really true, but it has like some truth in it. I would, you know, counter with like we are probably not as normal as we think we are. Many folks have just fit the expectations well enough that there's not that much friction and it's fine to step outside of it. My personal example is sports bars, right? That like it boggles my mind that someone would go there and enjoy that. And for me, I'm like, well, that must be where the neurotypicals live. Or like, it's like sports bars and like weddings, like really, really white, really straight weddings. That like just confuse and befuddle me because so much of space is just around like, you know, pleasantries and conversation and noise and ambience and all of this. And but I don't know. I don't know. I like vibe check people when I meet them. I'm like, you seem more normal than I would expect. Or more maybe more normie, but that's mostly like my inner goth child coming out to police. But yeah, there's not a good list. Jesse Meadows and who's the unmasking autism person? Send help. Thank you. Jesse Meadows and Devin Price have both like made their lists of like, I am neurodivergent because of these things, right? And so those are nice spots to look at to sort of piece things together, but that's what I have. We do one more? Yeah. Greg, go for it.
Yeah, hi, Maura. I mean, it's such a moving and deep work. I think it's always inspiring to me to see people when they can find a space that they can do such kind of personal work. And when they do such personal work, the things they do are just amazing. So thank you. And thank you for your vulnerability and being so open about it. I guess my kind of question is like where do we go next from here, and how can we take like this understanding? I know you've already experienced, you know, this political difficulty in the CSE department. You found your ways to navigate, just even creating that one space in the institution I'm at now at UMaine. I basically took my kind of faculty privilege to have my like grad class, teach my grad class on my research and be like, I'm not going to teach about my research. I'm going to do something that I think is more student-centered, and I won't get too much into that, but I'm just kind of curious how you see some of these ideas developing and what are some ways that people can kind of take action on them and how they might kind of percolate into more accessible things, bigger things.
That's a great question, and then I'm not entirely sure. This is the point let's see, I have like a cycle of when I do research, right? And we're at the point where like, I have no idea what to do next. We just need help. Send help. This is too much for just me. I think Amy offered a line at one point that was like, within the capacity that you have, make as much change as you can. And there are systemic limits on what I could do here, though much fewer than are at many other places. And so I think a space to start is that like it might look different, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. And that like there are spaces to sort of ask folks to pull apart themselves and create change, but exist within the microcosmos of an institution. The piece that I'm particularly curious about now is I feel like so many educators kind of come in saying, well, there's the established members here that are never going to change, that have been racist for a while, that have been sexist for a while, and not all of them are going to change, but I'm more curious about what can be done there, since I know that I can do it with students. So yeah, that's where I'm at now. Not totally sure.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to be. I mean, sometimes when you know, whoa, this huge societal problem one of many huge societal problems. I mean, definitely not going to find an answer off the cuff on this question to these things. So I just really appreciate it. And I like the thing I heard that I really liked was this foothold of just like, how can we just start making space to accept difference in some of the spaces that we already have, just to like allow people to express difference and then not be like immediately judged or taken down or something like that.
Yeah. Spaces for folks that are welcoming have been good for a very, very long time before and after this work. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you, Mara.
Time.
So yeah, let's give Mara another round of applause. And I'll ask our committee members, Amy,